So I know that I said that I wanted to pause pretty much all video content while I work on sort of a more comprehensive video on how to approach this current papacy under Francis. But honestly, that video has kind of been taking a bit longer than I thought it was going to take. It really does require a lot of, I think, research, precision, care. You really want to avoid excess. You want to avoid misrepresenting what Francis has actually said. You also want to make sure that you're showing due reverence to the office without also forgoing your own critical faculties. So that is going to take a little bit longer than I would have hoped. So in the meantime, I think it's okay to just put out short little topical videos on things that I think might be helpful. So one of those issues has been, the problem of evil and various theodicies that Christian theologians and doctors of the church and fathers have articulated throughout the centuries, how to deal with the whole problem of evil. I've never done a video on my channel about that yet, and I get asked about it all the time. So while this is definitely not going to be a systematic, comprehensive treatment of that issue, save that for a later date perhaps, I do want to sort of offer some reflections on it. So often when this issue is addressed, it seems to me that it's almost always trying to appeal to the abstract principle that God has morally sufficient reasons to permit various evils. And of course we all know the traditional answer as to why he does permit evil, right? So as to bring about a greater good. And usually it kind of ends there, right? There's a lot of work in justifying that abstract principle, but there's usually not really an attempt to probe a bit deeper into, well, what kind of higher good really would be sufficient, such that the worst evils and the worst kinds of sufferings imaginable could be reasonably permitted for the sake of that greater good. Now, most people, I think, would simply appeal to the mystery of divine providence, the mystery of the divine will, that God does have these morally sufficient reasons, and that will simply infallibly apply to each and every concrete situation. And of course, I think that's true, right? But I do think there's an additional way to go about this, where reflecting on human nature, what is truly ultimately good for human beings universally, can sort of give us insight into such a high good that would by itself outweigh any kind of evil or suffering that could befall somebody, that for the sake of which any evil that can happen can be permitted by God without compromising, even evidentially, his very goodness and omnibenevolence and so on. So what might that good be? Well, you have to think about it from the standpoint of human nature in its holistic universality, right? So every human person is one insofar as each human person participates in human nature, and we can analyze human nature according to its universal demands, needs, and of course teleological ends. And we know philosophically and from supernatural revelation that the ends of human nature are both natural and supernatural. Because of the rational soul of man, it has within itself an end, a teleological desire to know the first cause of all things. And of course, the first cause of all things, to know the first cause of all things as he is in himself, surpasses the finite capacity entirely, right? The only way that can happen is, as St. Thomas Aquinas says, for the divine to unite himself to a created intellect as an object made intelligible to it. So we know, therefore, that the pinnacle of man's fulfillment, the pinnacle of his happiness is that supernatural union with God as he is in himself. And that, because of its infinitude, must infinitely outweigh any natural good that would fall under the supernatural end. And of course, therefore, the natural end would always be subordinate to the supernatural end. This has to be a holistic view of man. And this is also why, of course, integralism is justified, right? Because the temporal good has to be subordinated to the supernatural good of the society. And you have to understand these things in a holistic way. You can't disentangle the natural good from the supernatural good, because grace perfects nature. There's not supposed to be any kind of antagonism between nature and grace. They're meant to go together. The grace is meant to perfect nature and therefore include nature, and any good of nature therefore would be subordinated to the supernatural good, the supernatural end. So because the supernatural end infinitely exceeds the natural end, and therefore the supernatural good infinitely exceeds any temporal or finite good that could be acquired in this life, we therefore have to ask the question, would not this supernatural good of itself justify the deprivation of any finite good, no matter how excellent, no matter how seemingly proximate it is to the supernatural good? If the deprivation of those finite goods would, even at the very least, present an opportunity for the rational creature to draw himself closer to the attainment of that supernatural good. And I think the answer to that would have to be yes. And furthermore, I think you can actually draw out a plausible case that really the deprivation of any finite good in any situation could indeed present itself as an opportunity to draw closer to that supernatural good. Now, why is that? Well, it's because A, the supernatural good so far and infinitely exceeds any finite good that could even be conceived of. As Gergo Lagrange says, for example, compared to God, compared to the immediate vision of the divine essence, an angel and a grain of sand are inequality, right? The highest finite good is but a grain of sand, and even less than that, compared to the immediate vision of the divine essence. So that's just to illustrate the chasm here that we're talking about. But number two, to the rational creature, who is not as yet in possession of this beatific vision of God, finite creatures are much more proximate to him. He's much more likely to be drawn to the alluring aura of finite glory, right? I mean, the very definition of mortal sin in many ways is choosing a finite good over and against the infinite good. Choosing a finite good precisely to the detriment of choosing the infinite good himself. So because of those two things, you can easily see how it may very well be in one's spiritual and supernatural benefit at times to be in total deprivation of finite goods. One could even say that it is precisely in the deprivation of finite goods, even maybe the total deprivation of finite goods, destitution even, that one could more clearly see the purity of the divine good, that one could most clearly see at a visceral level one's need, we can say, one's dependence upon and need for the supernatural good. I mean, to give sort of a natural analogy, just think of, when it's a cloudy day, the illumination and the brilliance of the sun is obscured because of all the clouds that are in the sky. It doesn't mean there's anything that's wrong with clouds per se. I mean, they're necessary for the fruit of the earth and things like that. But it is to say that the more cluttered the sky is with clouds, the less direct sunlight is, and the less one can see that the light that shines through the clouds comes exclusively from the sun, right? So similarly, when we're deprived of finite material goods, perhaps those are opportunities, those are spiritual opportunities that can make more manifest, make clearer to the intellect that all goods, they really come exclusively from God, and God is the only real source of fulfillment. So when we are unfulfilled by any finite creature, that presents an opportunity to recognize the insufficiency of any finite good to truly make up for that infinite yearning for the divine himself. Now, whether or not we take advantage of those opportunities is another matter. And, of course, I think the ability to choose freely whether or not to do this is itself necessary in order for spiritual progress to actually be made, because union with God of necessity must be a free act. Indeed, the beatific vision paradoxically draws the intellect and the will to union with God most freely. That is, most freely detached from anything that would weigh the soul down to finite good. So just because many do not take those opportunities in moments of deprivation of finite goods to seek the unconditioned good himself, that doesn't take away from the fact that the opportunity to do so outweighs any evil that can befall somebody. And I think, this is really a way that we can understand what Christ says when he speaks of the poor in spirit. That is to say, those who are destitute, or detached, rather, from material goods, finite goods, are in a unique position to seek the unconditioned good, to seek God himself, union with God. And, if we aren't physically deprived of finite goods, we still have to be spiritually deprived from them. And it only is easier to reach that sense of spiritual poverty if we are also happen to be deprived in moments of our life of finite goods that might cloud or obfuscate that clarity of yearning for God himself, who alone can fulfill what human nature truly needs for fulfillment, considered holistically. So, this is not to say that this is, like I said, constitutes a comprehensive take on the problem of evil, but I think it's a necessary vantage point from which to tackle the problem. And I don't think the problem of evil can be sufficiently tackled if this important element does not underlie one's entire approach to theodicy. So yeah, those are just some thoughts I had on the issue. I hope it was helpful for you. I hope it gave you something to think about. I definitely want to do more things like this in between, more comprehensive videos. They're definitely a lot easier to do than comprehensive videos. The fact that I've limited myself to comprehensive videos is in many ways why they've been so infrequent. So I think doing more things like this will probably help this channel stay more continuously active, even if a lot of the content is more off the cuff, non-scripted. I don't think that's really the worst thing in the world. So anyway, hope you enjoyed the video. Like, comment, subscribe. You can follow my Patreon, and I'll see you again soon. God bless.